The wind howling through the dead pines carried the distinct promise of a freezing death, but it was the piece of paper in the man's hand that had already sealed her fate. Before we step inside, tell me where you're watching from today. Ilara stood on the porch of the only home she had ever known, her breath pluming in the frigid air like pale smoke. She pulled her thin woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did nothing to stop the biting chill that seeped into her bones. Her husband, Thomas, had been in the ground for barely a month, taken by a sudden fever that had swept through the valley. Now the valley was taking the rest of her life. Mr. Silas Vance stood at the bottom of the porch steps, flanked by two heavy-set men who looked entirely uncomfortable in the dropping temperature. Vance wore a thick coat of tailored fur, his gloved hands holding a legal writ that fluttered frantically in the wind. He was a man who understood the power of paper, the power of ledgers, and the power of debts called in at the worst possible moment. He did not look at Ilara's face. He looked only at the sturdy timber of the house, the well-kept barn, and the fertile, dormant fields stretching out behind it. The writ was a fiction, a manipulation of boundaries and archaic banking laws that Thomas had never understood, but the sheriff had stamped it all the same. The law belonged to men like Mr. Vance, men who never swung an axe or turned the earth, but who reaped the harvest through signatures and seals. Vance cleared his throat, a dry, rattling sound that carried over the wind. He stated the terms of the eviction with a practiced monotone, his breath forming sharp clouds in the gray air. He informed her that the grace period had expired at noon. He informed her that the property now belonged to the Valley Lumber Conglomerate. He informed her that she had 10 minutes to gather what she could carry and leave the premises. Ilara did not argue. She knew the futility of arguing with a man who had already calculated the profit of her ruin. She turned and walked back into the house. The interior was already growing cold, the hearth fire having been allowed to burn down to gray ash. She moved methodically, suppressing the rising tide of panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She had a small canvas rucksack, the one Thomas had used for hunting trips. Into the rucksack went the absolute essentials of survival, chosen with a cold, practical logic. She packed a heavy wool blanket, tightly rolled and tied with twine. She packed her husband's hunting knife, its blade heavy and sharp, the handle worn smooth by his grip. She packed a tin box containing sulfur matches, a block of flint, and a bundle of dry char cloth. She packed the last heel of hard bread and a small wrapped wedge of salted cheese. She did not pack photographs. She did not pack letters. She packed only what would keep the blood moving through her veins for another day. She took a heavy canvas coat from the peg by the door, a coat that belonged to Thomas, smelling faintly of wood smoke and pine resin. She put it on over her dress, rolling up the sleeves so her hands were free. When she stepped back out onto the porch, Mr. Vance was checking a silver pocket watch, his expression tight with impatience. He nodded once as she descended the steps, a gesture devoid of any human sympathy. He signaled to his men who immediately moved toward the front door, producing a heavy iron padlock and a length of chain. Ilara walked away down the dirt road that led toward the town. She did not look back. The sound of the heavy iron chain rattling against the wooden doorpost echoed behind her, a final metallic period to her life in the valley. The sky above was the color of bruised iron, heavy and low, pressing down on the bare branches of the trees. The walk into town took an hour. The temperature continued to drop, the damp cold penetrating the layers of canvas and wool, settling into the joints of her knees and the tips of her fingers. The mud of the road had frozen solid, forming jagged ridges that twisted her ankles as she walked. She kept her head down, focusing on the mechanical rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other. When she reached the main street of the settlement, the silence was absolute. It was a Saturday, a day when the street should have been bustling with wagons and commerce. Instead, the doors were shut tight and the windows were blank. She saw the baker, a man who had shared meals at her table, turn away from his storefront window and disappear into the shadows of his shop. She saw the blacksmith strike an anvil, his eyes fixed firmly on the red-hot iron, refusing to look up as she passed. The community was complicit in its silence. They feared Mr. Vance and the economic ruin he could bring down upon any of them with a stroke of his pen. They chose their own security over her survival. They let her walk. The isolation was a physical weight, heavier than the rucksack on her shoulders. She was entirely alone, cast out from the fragile safety of the social order. Ilara did not stop at the sheriff's office. She did not stop at the church. She walked straight through the town and out the other side, taking the old logging trail that led up into the high ridges. She had a vague destination in mind, a distant sister living in a settlement 3 days' walk to the north. It was a desperate plan, a fool's journey in the face of the changing weather, but it was the only direction left to her. The forest swallowed her quickly. The tall pines closed in around the trail, blocking out the meager light of the afternoon. The wind shifted, no longer a steady push, but a swirling, chaotic force that whipped through the trees, tearing loose dead needles and sending them spinning through the air. The smell of the air changed. It lost the damp, earthy scent of late autumn and took on the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching winter storm. The first snowflakes fell an hour later. They were not soft, drifting flakes, but hard, crystalline pellets that stung her exposed cheeks like thrown sand. They bounced off the frozen ground, accumulating rapidly in the hollows and ruts of the trail. Ilara pulled the collar of the heavy canvas coat up around her ears and tied her shawl over her head, narrowing her eyes against the stinging ice. The temperature plummeted with terrifying speed. The cold was no longer just a discomfort. It was a physical assault, a predatory force actively seeking to drain the heat from her core. She felt the chill bypass her skin and settle deep into her muscles, making her movements sluggish and clumsy. She forced herself to walk faster, hoping the exertion would generate enough internal heat to stave off the freezing process. But the heavy coat and the uneven ground made every step a labor. The snowfall intensified, transforming from a scattered shower into a blinding white wall. The wind roared through the canopy above, a continuous deafening sound like a rushing river. The world shrank to a radius of 10 feet. The trail, already faint, vanished entirely beneath the rapidly accumulating snow. The landscape lost all defining features, becoming a chaotic blur of white and gray. Ilara realized she was lost. She stopped and leaned against the rough bark of a massive pine, her chest heaving, the cold air burning her lungs with every breath. She turned in a slow circle, trying to find any familiar landmark, any break in the trees that might indicate the direction of the trail. But there was nothing, just the endless, driving snow and the deepening drifts. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest, but she ruthlessly suppressed it. Panic meant irrational decisions, and irrational decisions meant death. She had to keep moving. If she stopped for too long, the cold would paralyze her muscles, and she would simply go to sleep in the snow, never to wake up. She pushed away from the tree and stepped forward into the whiteout. The physical mechanics of freezing began to take hold. First came the shivering, violent, and uncontrollable tremors that shook her entire body as her muscles desperately tried to generate friction and heat. Her teeth chattered so hard, her jaw ached. Her fingers and toes moved past pain, into a dangerous, terrifying numbness. She could no longer feel the ground beneath her boots. She walked for what felt like hours, a blind, stumbling march through the drifts. The snow was now up to her knees, dragging at her legs with every step. The heavy canvas coat, initially a shield, was now stiff with frozen moisture, a heavy carapace that restricted her movement. Her breathing became shallow and ragged. The shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, insidious lethargy. She knew the danger of that lethargy. She knew it was the final stage, the body's surrender to the cold. Her mind began to play tricks on her. The roaring wind sounded like distant voices. The dark shapes of the trees looked like houses offering warmth and shelter. She found herself wanting to just sit down, just for a moment, just to rest her eyes. The snow looked incredibly soft, like a vast white feather bed. She stumbled over a hidden root and fell hard, her face plunging into the freezing powder. She lay there for a long moment, the cold seeping into her face, the urge to remain still almost overpowering. But the memory of Mr. Vance's smug face, the memory of the heavy iron padlock snapping shut on her life, sparked a tiny, stubborn ember of anger deep within her. She refused to die quietly in the snow because a man with a piece of paper decreed it. She forced her hands under her chest and pushed upward. Her arms trembled wildly, lacking the strength to lift her. She tried again, digging the toes of her boots into the snow, and managed to heave herself onto her knees. She swayed there in the howling wind, orienting herself to nothing. She had to find shelter, a fallen tree, a rocky overhang, a hollowed-out root system, anything to break the wind. She began to crawl forward, her hands plunging deep into the snow, her knees dragging through the drifts. She moved blindly, guided only by the desperate instinct to survive. The ground beneath her suddenly pitched sharply downward. Before she could react, the snowy surface gave way, and she was falling. She tumbled down a steep embankment, crashing through brittle brush and buried branches. The world spun in a chaotic blur of white and dark wood. She hit the bottom hard. The breath knocked from her lungs in a sharp gasp. She lay in a heap, stunned and gasping for air, waiting for the pain of broken bones to register. But the deep snow had cushioned her fall. She was at the bottom of a narrow, steep-sided ravine. The change in the environment was immediate and profound. The howling wind that had battered her on the ridge was suddenly muted, passing high overhead, leaving the bottom of the ravine in a strange, still quiet. The snow here was deeper, but it was falling straight down, undisturbed by the gale above. Ilara sat up slowly, brushing the snow from her face. The light was failing rapidly, the gray afternoon giving way to the deep, impenetrable black of a winter night. She looked around the narrow confines of the ravine. The steep walls were composed of jagged stone and frozen earth, offering no obvious overhang or cave. She was out of the wind, but the temperature was still plummeting. She needed a fire, and she needed a windbreak. She dragged herself to her feet and began to wade through the deep snow along the bottom of the ravine, scanning the rock walls for any fissure or depression. The snow was waist-deep in places, requiring her to throw her weight forward and crush a path with her body. Her progress was agonizingly slow. Her hands were entirely numb, hanging like useless blocks of wood at the ends of her arms. Near the end of the ravine, where the rock walls converged into a tight V-shape, she saw something unnatural. It was a mound of snow, but the geometry was wrong. It was too square, too regular to be a natural drift over a boulder. She waded toward it, her heart hammering a weak, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She fell to her knees before the mound and began to dig. She used her forearms, sweeping the loose powder away in frantic arcs. The snow was deep, but it yielded easily. After a minute of desperate clearing, her arm struck something solid. It was not stone. It did not have the rough, irregular texture of rock. It felt smooth, flat, and hard. She scraped away more snow, leaning in close to see in the failing light. It was wood. Thick, ancient timber, gray with age but solid and unrotted. She cleared a wider area, revealing a vertical surface composed of heavy planks, bound together with rusted iron strapping. It was a door, set directly into the side of the ravine, built into the earth itself. A buried shelter, hidden from the world above, forgotten by time and the elements. Ilara felt a sudden, fierce surge of adrenaline. She tore at the snow with renewed ferocity, clearing the entire face of the door and the area immediately in front of it. She found a heavy iron latch, pitted with rust and frozen solid. She gripped it with both hands, ignoring the pain of the cold metal against her skin, and pulled. It did not move. The door was frozen shut, sealed by years of ice and disuse. She pulled again, throwing her entire body weight backward, her boots slipping in the snow. Nothing. She let go of the latch and pounded on the heavy timber with her fists in a moment of pure frustration. The wood existed, the shelter existed, the survival existed, but she was locked out in the cold. She forced herself to stop, to breathe, to think methodically. Panic would not open the door. Force had failed. She needed leverage. She turned and scanned the immediate area, finding a thick, broken branch protruding from the snow nearby. She pulled it free, testing its strength. It was solid oak, heavy and unbending. She wedged the end of the branch between the edge of the door and the heavy timber frame. She positioned her body against the other end of the branch, using it as a lever. She took a deep breath of the freezing air, braced her boots against a buried rock, and pushed with everything she had left. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wood groaned. The branch bent slightly and her muscles screamed in protest. Then, with a sharp, cracking sound like a gunshot, the ice seal broke. The heavy iron hinges shrieked in protest as the door gave way, swinging inward by a few inches. Ilara dropped the branch, grabbed the edge of the door, and hauled it open. She practically fell inside, collapsing onto a hard dirt floor. The darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness that smelled of dry earth, old dust, and cold iron. She pushed the door shut behind her, leaning against it until the latch clicked into place. The instant the door closed, the sound of the storm outside vanished entirely. The silence in the buried shelter was profound, heavy, and ancient. She lay on the floor for a long minute, letting her eyes adjust, though there was no light to adjust to. She was out of the wind, but the air inside the shelter was bitterly cold, holding the deep, penetrating chill of the surrounding earth. She was still freezing to death. The process had merely been slowed. She needed light, and she needed heat. Her fingers were clumsy, unresponsive lumps of flesh. She fumbled with the straps of her rucksack, struggling to undo the simple buckles. It took agonizing minutes of blind fumbling before she managed to open the flap and plunge her hand inside. She felt the rough wool of the blanket, the smooth handle of the knife, and finally the hard edges of the tin box. She pulled the box out and opened it, her hands trembling violently. She took out a single sulfur match. She knew she had to strike it right the first time. If she dropped it in the dark, she might never find it again. She held the match tightly between her thumb and forefinger, feeling for the rough, striking surface on the side of the tin. She struck the match. The sound was loud in the small space, followed instantly by the sharp, acrid smell of burning sulfur. The flame flared to life, a tiny, brilliant point of yellow light that pushed back the absolute darkness. Ilara held the match high, her eyes darting around the space, taking in the details before the flame burned down to her fingers. The shelter was a dugout, roughly 10 feet square. The walls were lined with heavy fieldstone, stacked tight and expertly fitted. The roof was supported by massive hand-hewn timber beams, blackened by years of smoke. In the center of the far wall stood the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. A heavy cast-iron stove, its surface rusted but intact, a thick black pipe rising from its top and disappearing into the earth above. Beside the stove was a neat, meticulously stacked cord of firewood, dry and gray with age, alongside a smaller pile of kindling and a wooden crate filled with dry moss and wood shavings. Someone had prepared this place. Someone had left it ready for a return that never happened. The match burned down, the heat biting her fingers. She dropped it, plunging the room back into darkness, but she had a mental map now. She moved toward the stove, her hands outstretched. She found the iron door of the firebox and pulled it open. It moved smoothly, the hinges still functioning. She felt inside. The grate was clear, a small bed of old dry ash resting at the bottom. She moved to the woodpile, gathering a handful of the dry moss and shavings. She placed them carefully in the center of the grate. She selected several pieces of the thinnest kindling, breaking them over her knee and arranging them in a loose teepee structure over the tinder, ensuring plenty of space for air to circulate. She was methodical. She was precise. Her life depended on the geometry of these small sticks. She took out a second match, struck it, and touched the flame to the dry moss. The ancient tinder caught instantly, flaring up with a bright, crackling light. The flame licked upward, catching the edges of the thin kindling. Ilara watched, holding her breath as the fire grew. She carefully added slightly larger sticks, building the heat, feeding the young flame with deliberate care. The firebox began to glow, casting a warm, flickering light across the stone walls of the shelter. Ilara closed the iron door, leaving the draft vent wide open. She sat back on her heels, waiting for the stove to begin radiating heat. The metal ticked and pinged as it expanded, a sound of awakening. Then the smoke began to leak. It didn't go up the pipe. It curled out from around the edges of the stove door, thick, gray, and acrid. At first it was just a wisp, but within seconds it became a steady stream, billowing into the small enclosed space of the shelter. The draft was failing. The chimney was blocked. Ilara coughed as the harsh smoke hit the back of her throat. The shelter was filling rapidly, the smoke banking against the low ceiling and rolling downward. Panic, suppressed for hours, flared brightly. She was trapped in a sealed box, slowly suffocating in the smoke of her own salvation. Her eyes watered, stinging fiercely, and her chest heaved as she tried to draw a clean breath. She scrambled backward, staying low to the floor where the air was temporarily clearer. She considered opening the heavy wooden door, but that would let the freezing wind back in, defeating the entire purpose of the shelter. The fire would consume the remaining oxygen, and she would either freeze or choke. She had to fix the system. She covered her mouth and nose with her sleeve and crawled back toward the stove. She felt the heavy black pipe rising from the back of the iron box. She ran her hands along the cold metal, feeling for a damper, a valve, anything that might be closed. She found a small iron handle set into the pipe a few feet above the stove. She twisted it, hoping it was a closed damper, but it moved freely and the smoke continued to pour into the room. The blockage was higher up. It was in the flue itself, where the pipe exited the earth. Years of disuse, accumulated debris, perhaps a collapsed bird's nest or a dead animal, had sealed the chimney tight. She could not reach it from the outside without braving the blizzard and climbing the steep, slippery bank of the ravine in the dark. That was impossible. She had to clear it from the inside. She remembered the stoves in the valley, the heavy iron beasts used in the logging camps. They often had clean-out traps for sweeping the chimney. She felt around the base of the pipe, where it met the stove body. Nothing. She felt higher up, just below the point where the pipe vanished into the timber ceiling. There, on the backside, her fingers brushed against a small square iron plate held in place by a rusted wing nut. The smoke was thick now, reducing visibility to a few inches. Ilara was coughing uncontrollably, her lungs burning. She stood up, plunging her head into the thickest part of the smoke layer, and grabbed the wing nut. It was frozen with rust. She twisted it with her bare fingers, tearing the skin, but it refused to turn. She dropped back to the floor, gasping for air. She needed a tool. She pulled Thomas's hunting knife from her belt. She stood up again, holding her breath, and jammed the thick back edge of the knife blade against one of the wings of the nut. She struck the handle of the knife with the heel of her hand, using it like a hammer and chisel. The metal groaned. She struck it again, harder this time, ignoring the jarring pain in her wrist. The wing nut broke free with a sharp squeak. She unscrewed it rapidly, pulling the small iron plate away. A shower of black soot and dry, crumbly debris cascaded out of the hole, covering her face and shoulders. She plunged her hand into the opening, feeling upward into the pipe. Her fingers met a solid mass of packed earth, dead leaves and twigs. A massive nest built over years by some small creature had completely choked the flue. She dug her fingers into the mass, tearing it apart, pulling out handfuls of the obstruction and throwing it onto the floor. She dug deeper, her arm buried up to the elbow in the filthy pipe. She scraped at the sides, breaking the hard-packed seal. Suddenly, a rush of cold air blasted down the pipe, hitting her face. The obstruction was clear. The draft had been re-established. She pulled her arm out and quickly slapped the iron plate back into place, securing the wing nut. She dropped back to the floor, coughing violently, spitting black soot from her mouth. She watched the stove. The smoke leaking from the door abruptly stopped. The sound of the fire changed from a muffled crackle to a deep, roaring rush as the fresh oxygen was drawn violently through the vent and up the clear chimney. The system worked. The heavy iron of the stove began to radiate a profound, intense heat. It pushed back the damp chill of the dugout, warming the stone walls and the dirt floor. Ilara lay on the ground, too exhausted to move, letting the heat wash over her. It was a physical weight, pressing into her frozen muscles, slowly unthawing the ice in her blood. The pain of the returning circulation was agonizing, 1,000 hot needles pricking her skin, but she welcomed it. It was the pain of survival. She lay there for a long time, watching the firelight dance across the rough-hewn beams above. The smoke slowly cleared, drawn out through the draft of the roaring stove. She had won the first battle. She had secured warmth. She had secured shelter. But she knew that survival was not a single victory. It was a continuous process of maintenance and labor. When her strength returned enough to sit up, she opened the stove door and added 3 larger logs from the woodpile, arranging them carefully to burn slow and hot through the night. She closed the door and adjusted the draft, listening to the steady, comforting roar of the fire. She needed to understand her environment. She stood up, her joints popping and aching, and began to explore the small shelter by the light of the fire. The space was meticulously organized, built by someone who understood the necessity of order in a confined space. Along the left wall, a series of heavy wooden shelves had been built into the stone. She approached the shelves. They were lined with glass mason jars, sealed with wax and heavy metal lids. She wiped the thick layer of dust from one of the jars and held it close to the firelight. It was filled with preserved peaches, suspended in a thick amber syrup. The next jar held dark, tightly packed venison. Another held pickled beans. The original builder had not just built a shelter. They had built a fortress against starvation. Beneath the shelves, resting on the dry dirt floor, were 3 large galvanized metal cans with tight-fitting lids. She pried the lid off the first one. It was filled to the brim with dry white flour, completely untouched by moisture or vermin. The second contained oats. The third held dried corn. Ilara felt a profound sense of awe. This was not a temporary hunting blind. This was a sustained survival cache. It was a testament to a level of practical knowledge and foresight that the men in the valley, men like Mr. Vance, had entirely forgotten. They relied on supply lines, on credit, on the labor of others. The person who built this relied only on their own 2 hands and the bounty of the earth. On a small wooden table tucked into the corner, she found an old, heavy iron lantern and a tin of kerosene. She checked the reservoir. It was half full. She trimmed the wick with her knife, struck a match, and lit the lantern. The warm, yellow glow illuminated the entire shelter, revealing details she had missed in the flickering firelight. Beside the lantern on the table lay a large, leather-bound book. It was a ledger, similar to the ones Vance used to record debts, but this one was different. The leather was worn soft, stained with oil and dirt. Ilara opened it. The pages were filled with tight, meticulous handwriting. The ink faded to a pale brown. It was a journal, a record of labor and observation. The first entry was dated nearly 40 years ago. The author was a man named Elias, one of the original pioneers who had surveyed the valley long before the lumber companies arrived. He wrote of the harsh winters, the shifting behavior of the game, the best times to harvest the wild onions and the tubers that grew near the river. He wrote about the construction of the shelter. He detailed the specific depth required to maintain a constant temperature, the method for stacking the fieldstone to prevent collapse, the design of the internal draft system that she had just repaired. He wrote not of conquering the landscape, but of aligning with it, of understanding the flow of water, air, and heat. Ilara sat at the small table, reading the words of a dead man. Elias became her mentor across time. He taught her how to check the seals on the preserved jars, how to mix the flour with water and ash to bake hard bread on the flat top of the stove, how to render animal fat for light and energy. The ledger was a manual for survival, written in the language of practical experience, not legal fiction. If you've stayed with the story this far, you're about to discover why practical knowledge always outlasts paper arrogance. She set to work. The problem of water was immediate. She took a heavy iron pot hanging from a hook near the stove, opened the heavy timber door a crack, and scooped it full of the deep snow blocking the entrance. She placed the pot on the flat top of the roaring stove. Within minutes, the snow melted down to a few inches of clear, steaming water. She drank deeply from a tin cup she found on the shelves. The water tasted of iron and wood smoke, but it was the best thing she had ever consumed. It hydrated her parched throat and warmed her from the inside out. She followed Elias's instructions for the food. She opened a jar of the preserved venison, the wax seal cracking sharply under her knife. The meat was dark and intensely salty, preserved perfectly in its own rendered fat. She ate it slowly, feeling the heavy protein begin to rebuild her depleted strength. The bread existed, the meat existed, the shelter existed. She was no longer just surviving. She was sustaining. For 3 days, the blizzard raged outside. Ilara did not see the sun. She lived by the rhythm of the stove and the lantern. She established a strict, methodical routine. Wake, check the draft, add wood, melt snow, read the ledger, prepare food, clean the space, sleep. She learned the eccentricities of the iron stove. She learned how to bank the coals at night with a layer of ash so they would hold their heat until morning. She learned how to position the damp wood near the stove to dry it out before burning. She learned how to listen to the wind whistling over the buried chimney to gauge the strength of the storm above. The shelter, initially a terrifying black box, became a sanctuary. The stone walls held the heat perfectly, radiating a constant, comforting warmth. The air was dry and clean. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a quiet triumph that replaced the fear and the grief. Mr. Vance had cast her out to die, but he had inadvertently pushed her into a place of absolute security, a place where his rules did not apply. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind stopped. The silence woke her. It was heavy and complete, lacking the low, continuous roar that had been the background noise of her existence for the past 3 days. She sat up in her woolen blanket, listening intently. Nothing. She dressed in the heavy canvas coat, unlatched the heavy timber door, and pushed. It was blocked by a massive drift, but the snow was light and powdery. She dug her way up and out, breaking through the surface of the snowpack and emerging into the ravine. The world was blindingly bright. The sky was a hard, flawless blue, completely devoid of clouds. The sun reflected off the pristine white surface of the snow, forcing her to squint. The landscape had been entirely transformed, smoothed over and buried under feet of fresh powder. The air was still bitterly cold, but it was still and sharp, lacking the predatory bite of the wind. Ilara stood at the bottom of the ravine, breathing in the clean air. She was alive. She was warm. She was fed. She possessed a deep, unshakable confidence, born of methodical labor and the application of ancestral knowledge. She looked up at the ridge, where the old logging trail was buried somewhere beneath the snow. Then she heard the sound. It was faint, muffled by the deep snow, but distinct in the absolute silence of the frozen valley. It was a rhythmic thrashing, accompanied by a low, desperate sound that might have been a groan or a shout. It was coming from the top of the ridge, near where she had fallen. She moved quickly, utilizing the path she had broken through the snow days before. Though it was now partially filled in, she climbed the steep embankment of the ravine, digging her boots into the packed snow, pulling herself up by exposed roots and buried branches. She crested the ridge and looked out over the expanse of the old trail. 50 yards away, half buried in a massive drift, were 2 figures. They were not walking. They were crawling, thrashing weakly against the deep powder. They lacked snowshoes. They lacked proper gear. They were struggling with the frantic, uncoordinated movements of men who were in the final stages of hypothermia. Ilara recognized the heavy fur coat immediately, even though it was now matted with snow and ice. It was Mr. Silas Vance. Beside him, struggling even less, was his heavy-set foreman. She understood what had happened. Vance, arrogant and impatient, had likely tried to force his way back to the logging camp or the town before the storm fully broke, trusting his authority and his horses over the reality of the weather. The horses were gone, likely broken down or run off. The men were trapped in the environment they claimed to own, but entirely lacked the knowledge to survive. Ilara stood on the ridge, watching them struggle. The situational irony was profound. The man who had used paper and law to cast her out to freeze was now freezing to death on his own stolen land. He had dismissed practical knowledge, dismissed the labor of the hands, and now the physical world was exacting its absolute price. She did not feel pity, but she also did not feel the desire for revenge. Revenge was an emotion for those who felt powerless. Ilara was not powerless. She was the master of this environment. She possessed the heat. She possessed the food. She possessed the shelter. She walked toward them, her steps steady and sure in the deep snow. She did not run. She moved with the methodical grace of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. Vance looked up as she approached. His face was a mask of frostbite and terror. His lips were blue, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. He saw the widow he had evicted, standing over him in the pristine snow, looking down with a calm, analytical gaze. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to issue an order, perhaps to beg, but only a dry croak emerged. Ilara did not speak to him. She did not gloat. She simply reached down, grabbed the heavy collar of his ruined fur coat, and hauled him upward. He was dead weight, but she had spent the last 3 days hauling wood and water. She dragged him out of the deep drift and onto the slightly firmer snow of her packed trail. She went back for the foreman, grabbing him by the arms and dragging him alongside Vance. They were both slipping into unconsciousness, the deep lethargy of the freeze taking hold. "Move," Ilara said, her voice flat and hard. "Crawl if you have to. If you stop, you die." She didn't wait for them to respond. She turned and began to walk back toward the edge of the ravine, breaking the trail wider so they could follow. Fear and the primal instinct to survive forced the two men to follow her, dragging their bodies through the snow, driven by the sheer force of her command. She led them down the steep embankment, practically throwing them down the slide she had created. They tumbled to the bottom of the ravine, landing in a heap in the quiet, windless space. Ilara moved past them, pushed open the heavy timber door of the shelter, and stepped inside. She left the door open. The warm, fire-lit air spilled out into the cold, carrying the smell of wood smoke and roasted venison. It was an irresistible lure. The two dying men dragged themselves across the threshold, collapsing onto the hard dirt floor, gasping as the intense heat hit their frozen bodies. Ilara closed the door and latched it. She moved methodically. She did not offer them comfort. She offered them survival. She stripped their frozen outer coats from them, ignoring their weak protests. She dragged them closer to the stove, but not too close, knowing that rapid thawing would cause excruciating pain and tissue damage. She poured warm snow water into 2 tin cups and forced them to drink. She watched as they choked it down, their hands shaking violently. She then took a small amount of the preserved venison, warmed it on the stove, and handed it to them. They ate like starving animals, tearing at the meat, the grease running down their chins. Vance sat on the dirt floor, leaning against the cold stone wall, staring at the roaring cast-iron stove, the stacked wood, the shelves of food, and finally at Ilara. The arrogance was entirely gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound, shaking realization of his own utter insignificance in the face of the natural world. His paper reed was meaningless here. His wealth could not buy a single degree of heat. His life had been entirely dependent on the mercy and competence of the woman he had tried to destroy. Ilara sat at the small wooden table, the leather ledger open before her. She did not look at him. She simply turned a page, her finger tracing the faded ink of the pioneer's words. The shelter was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the ragged breathing of the two men. The storm was over. The lesson had been taught. The ground has a long memory, and it yields only to those who understand its rules. The next morning, Elara led the two men back to the town. They walked in silence, broken men, their physical survival bought at the cost of their social supremacy. When they reached the main street, the townspeople emerged from their homes staring in disbelief. They saw Mr. Vance, the untouchable titan of the valley, stumbling and frostbitten, being led like a lost child by the widow he had cast out. The foreman, a man who respected strength above all else, became the first witness. He stood in the center of the street and told the story. He told of the whiteout, the freezing death that had gripped them, and the buried fortress where the widow had mastered the fire and the ice. He spoke of the impossible heat, the ancient food, and the calm, terrifying competence of Elara. The community, previously silent out of fear, now turned their gaze upon Vance. The illusion of his power was shattered. A man who could not survive a single night in the timber he claimed to own was not a man to be feared. He was a fool to be pitied. Vance's legal claims unraveled rapidly in the following weeks. The Valley Lumber conglomerate, embarrassed by his public humiliation and incompetence, severed his contract. The archaic laws he had used to steal the land were challenged and overturned by a town that no longer feared his retaliation. He left the valley quietly, a hollow man, his paper empire dissolved by the reality of the cold. Elara did not return to the house Thomas had built. She claimed the ravine. She claimed the buried shelter. She spent her days studying the ledger, expanding the root cellar, and applying the pioneer's knowledge to the surrounding forest. She became a fixture of the valley, not as a victim, but as a master of the environment, a living repository of the forgotten skills that had built the settlement in the first place. The bread existed, the vegetables existed, the shelter existed. She had found them all in the dark and brought them into the light. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Frontier Chronicles and consider becoming a paid member of our channel.